Garlic is a relatively easy crop to grow, and for many years I was simply replanting the biggest of the cloves and growing them in a fairly conventional way. In the last 2 years I've been exploring more about growing garlic to see how the yields or quality might improve and what varieties might be better to grow. These explorations and trials were interesting enough, and they allowed me to develop a better understanding of this crop. These trials were also a fair amount of work and took up a lot of space, and I'm not sure if I was able to find overly useful answers to questions that I've had about growing garlic in this part of Ireland. But as I plant out the cloves for next year's garlic, I feel I might be able to grow a better crop this time. Not necessarily because I have better answers, but perhaps more because I have a better understanding of the interconnected factors that could lead to a better crop. I generally plant the garlic cloves for next year's crop in November, mainly because that's when I finally get around to it, not because I'm confident that this is the best option. I have been wondering if planting earlier would allow the plants to become more established over winter, so that we could possibly get a bigger and perhaps earlier crop the next summer. Or if planting later would prevent the young plants from being exposed to the worst of the winter weather, while still being able to send out roots to get a head start on the season. So I thought I'd do a trial in the garlic bed of one of the gardens where I planted the cloves in 4 different dates, roughly a month apart, from October to January. And I included 4 different varieties in each planting, which of course made things more complicated, which is something I tend to do. This meant that there was only 5 plants in a short cross row for each variety for each planting date, and that sample size was probably way too low, which meant that any random issue with any one plant could skew the results quite a bit. Looking at the actual harvest data, it does seem that different varieties do better when planted at different months. But the rows that produced the worst results were likely because the cloves I planted for that variety were not in great shape, with possible mold developing, and some of the plants died. And the plants of the variety beside it were able to take advantage of this extra space to produce much bigger bulbs. Apart from these distortions, there doesn't seem to be much difference between the different planting dates, and I can just plant when it's convenient, which is a useful thing to learn. But I need to remember that this is only a small sample size for 1 year. With different weather conditions, I could easily see getting different results. This bed of garlic for the planting day trial was covered with a crop cover over hoops, mainly to prevent the birds from pulling up the cloves or young plants. But the cover also sheltered the crop from the stronger winter winds, and without this covering, the results of that trial might have been different. In 2 of the other gardens, I covered the garlic bed with a movable cold frame, and this covering was removed in mid-March when the plants were really well established. I had the cold frame sitting there, so I figured it was an easy way to protect the crop from the birds and to create a more protected microclimate over the winter. And inside one of these cold frames, I added a layer of loose straw on the surface of the soil after planting the garlic, as I had heard that straw can be a useful overwintering mulch for garlic. The clusters of garlic in the polyculture garden were really spread out with lots of space, at least until the other plants were established, and only covered with a netting to keep off the birds, which allowed all of the winter weather in. By mid-March, when these different covers were removed, I didn't notice much size difference between the plants that were covered in different ways. Any impact could have been masked by different fertility levels or the different amounts of space that the plants had. In the one garden, the cooling impact of the straw on the soil might have countered any benefit of the microclimate created by the cold frame. With all the other variables, I'm not sure that this fairly random exploration of different coverings led to anything useful. I used to grow only one variety of garlic that I picked at random many years ago, and it seemed to grow well, but I didn't know how it compared to other possibilities. 2 years ago, I decided to try other varieties and ended up getting all of the varieties available from my usual supplier. I grew 10 varieties of garlic in 2023 and added another 2 varieties this past year, which is a lot, especially for a crop that most people wouldn't be able to notice the difference of. I grew all 12 varieties this year in a polytunnel and in 2 outside gardens, and I also planted them all in large grow bags. With multiple plantings over 2 years, I think this is one of the more reliable trials that I've done, especially as a lot of the results are fairly consistent. Some varieties grew fairly poorly or consistently produced a smaller yield of garlic bulbs, especially the hardneck varieties. And some of them seem to be able to produce bigger bulbs with bigger cloves, which is useful, assuming that people prefer to use bigger garlic cloves in the kitchen. If I just wanted to grow one variety that produced the biggest yield, I could simply select one of these to grow every year from now on, especially as a few of them are quite similar and bred from the same origin. But it would also make sense to continue to grow a range of different types, as a diverse range of garlic may be more useful and enjoyable in the kitchen. And diversity can be more resilient, especially as we cannot assume future growing seasons are going to be similar to the ones that we've had in recent years. But this is where I find it difficult to select a smaller number of varieties to continue to grow. Selecting for the highest yield means that I would end up growing only one or two different types of garlic, and it would make sense to perhaps just grow one variety. On the other hand, selecting for diversity and possible resilience means I get a reduced yield, especially if I include the most interesting varieties that don't produce a lot. I was pleased to find that the variety I've been growing for years produced well in these trials. But I wonder if saving and planting the largest cloves from the largest bulbs for many years has helped my own strain of this variety to adapt to the local conditions, apparently through epigenetic changes. I had purchased new bulbs of the same variety 2 years ago and grew this newer strain separately, but it hasn't produced as well as the strain that I've been growing for several years. This supports the idea of adaptation to the local climate over many years, but of course there could be other factors. If this adaptation has taken place, then the other productive varieties in the trials achieve similar yields as my standard variety without this advantage, as I've only saved cloves for one season for most of them. And I'm quite interested in one of the two new varieties that I bought for this past year, as it produced very big bulbs in the first season on this site. If I can expect it to adapt and improve over the next few years, then it could become a better option than my standard variety. And as it is from the same family or type of garlic, this new variety could replace the old one, but I'll have to see how things work out over the next few years. While a strain of garlic may adapt over the years, I think simply planting larger cloves can have a much greater and more immediate impact, as the young plant has a bigger store of nutrients and energy to start with. And I think planting different sizes of garlic cloves for different varieties may have been one of the reasons why some varieties have produced more or less than others. This is something that I should have more carefully controlled in the trials I have done, where it would have been better to only use a certain size or weight of clove when planting to give all the plants the same start. But some varieties seem to generally produce a greater number of smaller cloves, and if they don't produce the really large cloves that other varieties do, then they won't be able to pass on as much nutrients and energy to the next generation. This may be why some of the varieties didn't do as well in the trials, as the young plant didn't get that strong start, even if they can grow quite well in this context. The relationship between the size of the clove that was planted, the space given to each plant, and the size of the garlic bulb that it produces is an interesting one. Big cloves planted farther apart may produce the biggest bulbs, but not necessarily the largest amount of garlic in total from the full bed. And if I only have smaller cloves to plant, is it better to plant them closer together to get many more smaller bulbs, but still a decent yield? I wanted to explore this relationship some more, so I set up a trial in the polytunnel comparing 3 different clove sizes and 4 different planting densities. This is 12 different combinations, and as with many of the trials and explorations that I do, the results are a bit confusing, or at least not as straightforward as I would expect. The bulbs generally did get bigger with the larger cloves and with more space between the plants, but not so consistently. The bulbs at the end of the bed had less competition and grew bigger than expected, which distorted the yield data, and I should have anticipated this. Other bulbs in the center of the bed grew smaller because of too much competition, and the ones on the edge right beside them grew bigger than expected, which is a useful thing to observe. And there were a few other results that seemed out of place for some other reason. Overall, the larger cloves and more space produced larger bulbs, and the closer the plants were, the larger the yield per square meter. But the increased competition of closer spacing eventually led to a less consistent crop. All of this makes sense and it is interesting to observe, but I'm not sure it's worth the space and time of doing a trial like this. I also need to remember that things would change in the outside gardens, including selecting wider spacing to potentially reduce the chance of diseases. The soil condition and fertility, the climate, the size of the garlic patch, how close it is to other plants in the gardens, growing in a single row rather than in blocks, and of course growing different varieties could all change things. And factors such as ease of weeding and producing the size of bulbs and cloves that are more useful in the kitchen might be more important than the biggest yield or the biggest bulbs. So what did I learn from all of this? There doesn't seem to be an obvious best date for the planting of a range of different varieties of garlic. If I was growing only one variety, I might be able to narrow down a better planting time, but that probably depends on the type of overwintering covering, if any, and the type of winter weather that we get. There is a significant range in the yield of different varieties, and ones developed from a particular origin seem to produce more in this context, and other types of garlic are less successful. Adaptation to the local conditions over many years might be a factor, but better yields may be more the result of larger cloves. Planting larger cloves usually produces larger bulbs, and closer spacing leads to higher yields, but there is a point when competition within the bed leads to problems and a less consistent crop. I also learned that trials like this take a lot of work and take up a lot of space, and sometimes they don't produce very useful results. It seems that each step towards finding specific answers takes more effort and is more likely to be impacted by other variables. So fewer variables and a larger sample size are needed, but the more control there is, the less like growing in the real world it becomes. All of this is interconnected with different varieties, timing and spacing, and overwintering coverings affecting how well a crop will do, and of course the soil fertility, diseases, and variable weather conditions will change things. It is a complex system where exploration by trying things out and observation is probably a more useful strategy than searching for answers through more controlled trials, especially if we are looking to consistently get a decent and reliable crop of garlic, not striving for the best possible yields. I went overboard with the garlic trials this past year and grew a lot of garlic, probably too much. So I will be scaling back the planting for next year, limiting this crop to only one bed in one of the gardens. In half of the bed, I am planting all 12 varieties again, as it seems a shame to not replant them, to keep them going, to see what happens. Every year we have different weather conditions, and I don't feel that I've taken the opportunity to really explore their differences in the kitchen. So continuing with all the varieties makes sense to me. In the other half of the bed, I am planting long rows of 5 different varieties that I think have done reasonably well in the previous trials. With these 5 varieties, I want to see the effect that different overwintering coverings will have in a side-by-side trial, and it will be interesting to see how these hardy plants respond to the different microclimates over winter. Of course, I'm planting the biggest cloves from the biggest bulbs that I saved this past year, and I think moderate spacing is more useful in this outside garden. Next summer, I want to focus on observing the progression of garlic rust on the different varieties, which can really reduce the health and productivity of this crop. I would like to explore using sprays and other options to reduce the impact of this disease, but I think that might be too many variables to properly evaluate, so that'll probably have to wait until the following year. I also want to pay closer attention to when each of the varieties mature, as I missed the ideal harvest window for a few of the varieties this past year. I think I've set things up so that I can increase my knowledge and understanding of a few aspects of growing garlic that I haven't paid enough attention to in the past. And hopefully, with a smaller area of garlic overall compared to previous years, I'll be able to be more observant of all the interconnected factors that impact how these plants will grow, rather than relying mainly on a set of numbers at the end of the season to try to figure out what happened.